Well, thank you for sticking by. This is a difficult time, primarily for you, not for me, because I'm not going to go to sleep while I'm speaking. But after we have a meal, we have the tendency to kind of doze off. So I'll be watching you very carefully. And if I see somebody dozing off, I'll say, "Wake up!" All right, let's have a word of prayer. We're going to talk about the image of the beast and his image. Father in heaven, we ask that you will be with us as we continue our study of these prophecies of Holy Scripture. I ask, Lord, that this might not only be an academic enterprise, but that we will assimilate this and prepare for the great events that will soon occur in this world. We thank you for the promise of your presence, and we claim that promise in Jesus' name. Amen. Many interpretations of the Bible prophecies these days are haphazard and speculative. Expounders of Bible prophecy, they say this means this and that means that, without any backing. However, in our presentation this afternoon, we are going to not speculate. We will use what I call the historical flow method, also known as historicism. It's the method that we need to study when we go through the chain prophecies of the Bible, such as Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Revelation 13. Our study will be disciplined, logical, and above all, biblical. We're going to study Daniel chapter 2. Then we're going to take a look at Daniel 7. And then we're going to move to Revelation chapter 13. We're going to find that Daniel 7 expands upon Daniel 2. And Revelation 13 expands upon Daniel 7 and Daniel 2. So in other words, Daniel 2 is expanded and Daniel 7 is further expanded in Revelation chapter 13. They're parallel prophecies, but each prophecy adds details to the previous prophecies. So we're going to focus on those three chapters: Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Revelation 13. By the way, at our Anchor School of Theology, which we have once a year, it was held this year in March, I dealt with this, studying Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 12, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17. So we're only going to have a partial view today. And by the way, we dedicated 24 hours in our Anchor School of Theology. So you can imagine what it's like to present everything in one session. But I'm going to do my best. So let's go first of all to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. And probably you don't even need to go there, because we're probably mostly acquainted with this root prophecy of the Bible. Now, we're going to find that this prophecy is the best example of the Seventh-day Adventist method of studying the chain prophecies. Because in Daniel 2, the sequence begins with Babylon in 605 BC. And then you have an unbroken chain of events. You have, first of all, the head of gold. It represents Babylon. God, through Daniel, said to Nebuchadnezzar, "You are that head of gold." In other words, the head of gold represents Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, Babylon, which ruled from 605 BC to 539 BC. Then after that, another kingdom rises, which is the breast and arms of silver. So you have this metallic man, breast and arms of silver. And that kingdom represents Medo-Persia. It's a dual kingdom. Medes and Persians, one kingdom composed of two nations. And that kingdom lasts from 539 to 331 BC. It represents the Medes and the Persians. Then you have the belly of the image. And the belly represents Greece, which is the kingdom that conquered the Medes and Persians. And Greece ruled from 331 BC to 168 BC. Remember that before Christ, the years go downward to the year 0, and then they go up after that. And then we have the legs of the image. The legs are of iron. And the legs of iron represent the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, a united Roman Empire, undivided. That's what the legs represent. But then, the legs of iron continue in the feet, in the 10 toes. There is iron in the feet. In other words, Rome continues, the Roman Empire continues, but in a divided state. That's why you have 10 toes. So, the iron kingdom of Rome continues, but in a divided state, which are the 10 toes of the image. And then something happens. And that is that clay is added to the feet. And now you have a mixture. You have a mixture of the iron of Rome, but you also have clay mingled with the iron. Now, I don't have time to really get into the meaning of the clay. You're going to have to accept it by faith. You'll be able to watch the entire Anchor School of Theology maybe in a month or so when they finish doing post-production editing. And then you'll be able to get a full 1-hour presentation just on what the clay represents. The clay represents the church. And the iron represents the civil power of Rome. In other words, in the feet, you have, first of all, the division of Rome, of political Rome, into 10 kingdoms. And then the church is united with the state in the feet. Are you following that? So in the feet, you have a union of church, the clay, and state in the territory of Europe, because the feet represents the divisions of the Roman Empire, which is mainly in Western Europe. And then, of course, you have the judgment scene. You have the iron and the clay lasts until 1798. In a moment, you're going to see in the parallel prophecy of Daniel 7 that the scenario I'm giving you of Daniel 2 is correct, because Daniel 7 adds to Daniel 2. So then you have this judgment scene in Daniel chapter 2, the everlasting kingdom. The stone comes, smashes the image on the feet, smashes everything to smithereens, and Christ establishes his everlasting kingdom. So Daniel 2 ends with the establishment of the everlasting kingdom. As Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, God will raise up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and it shall never pass away. So Daniel 2 ends with the everlasting kingdom. So basically, this is historicism. This is the historical, I prefer to call it the historical flow method, where you have events of prophecy in unbroken sequence. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, divided Rome. Rome, union of church and state. Then the everlasting kingdom. Without any gaps, no parentheses, at least in Daniel chapter 2. History has flowed from one event to another in unbroken sequence. So that is Daniel chapter 2. Now Daniel chapter 7 expands upon Daniel chapter 2. It gives us further details. What do we have in Daniel chapter 7? Instead of metals, we have beasts. In other words, the beasts are equivalent to the metals in the image. Let's review what Daniel 7 contains. First of all, you have a lion. The lion is parallel to the head of gold. Right? Gold is the king of metals, and the lion is the king of beasts. So the lion represents which kingdom? Babylon. The same thing as the head of gold in Daniel 2. Then you have another kingdom, a bear. It's represented by the silver, breast and arms of silver in Daniel chapter 2. So you have the Medes and Persians in Daniel 7. Then you have a leopard beast. And the leopard beast represents Greece. The same thing as the brass in the thighs and in the belly of Daniel chapter 2. Then you have a dragon-like beast, a nondescript beast, a terrible beast, iron teeth, and it tramples on everything it finds. That represents the Roman Empire, the united Roman Empire. But then something happens, and we're going to read this in a moment. Something happens, and that is that 10 horns come out on the head of this dragon beast. They're not there when the dragon beast first rises. The dragon beast is by itself. After a while, it sprouts 10 horns, which are equivalent to the 10 toes of the image. Are you with me? And then, after the 10 are there, then after a while rises a little horn. And this little horn is not only a civil power. This little horn is a mixture of church and state. It's a civil power besides being a religious power. You say, how do you know that? Because the prophecy tells us that this is the only kingdom that messes with God. All the other kingdoms were merely civil kingdoms. But the little horn is a civil kingdom. It's a state, but it's a state that performs religious activities. It speaks blasphemies against the Most High. It persecutes the saints of the Most High. It thinks that it can change God's law. None of the previous kingdoms did this. The previous kingdoms simply were civil kingdoms. They were states. They were nations. But they're not involved in religious observances. And the Bible tells us that this little horn rules for time, times, and the dividing of time, which is 3.5 years. 3.5 years times 360 days each year comes out to 1,260. Now we know how long the mixture of iron and clay lasted. Daniel 2 doesn't tell us. That simply says that in the feet you have this mingling of church and state, iron and clay. Daniel 7 tells us how long it was going to last. The little horn was going to rule this civil kingdom. This state, who is also a church, was going to rule for 1,260 years. And of course, that is from 538 to 1798. Now let's go to Daniel chapter 7 and read the key verses that we have just described. Daniel chapter 7. And we want to begin reading at verse 23. Daniel 7:23. It's going to talk about the fourth beast, which is the kingdom of Rome. It says, thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth trample it and break it in pieces. So you have this terrible dragon beast that is trampling on everything. But now notice verse 24. The 10 horns, listen carefully now, are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. Let me ask you, does the kingdom exist before the 4 horns come out of the kingdom? Let's read it again. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom. In order to rise from this kingdom, the kingdom has to exist before they rise. Are you with me? So you have the dragon beast, which is pagan Rome. Then you have the 10 horns, which are the divisions of pagan Rome. But that's not the end. It continues saying in verse 24, and another shall arise after them. After which ones? After the 10. So how many stages does Rome have according to this? Rome has 3 stages. The first stage is the dragon beast by itself. The next stage is when it sprouts 10 horns. And then after it sprouts 10 horns, the third stage is when the little horn comes out among the 10. Is that clear? 3 stages of Rome. Pagan Rome, divided Rome, and papal Rome. And what does this little horn do? Let's go to verse 25. He, the little horn, shall speak pompous words against the Most High. Revelation identifies these pompous words as blasphemies. Now, of course, blasphemy is when a mere man claims to be God and when a mere man claims to have power to forgive sins, which is true of the papacy. The papacy claims that the Pope is Christ's representative on earth. He takes Christ's place on earth. And the papacy claims that it has power to forgive sins. And so it says he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High. That wasn't in Daniel 2, right? There's no mention of persecution in Daniel 2. But Daniel 7 is expanding. And so it says, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, shall intend to change times and law, then the saint shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. Now let me ask you, do iron and clay belong together? What person in their right mind would mix iron and clay? They're totally different elements. It weakens the clay and it weakens the iron, because they should not be joined together. Let me ask you, should church and state be joined together? No. They're 2 separate things. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Jesus said, my kingdom, the church, is not of this world. In other words, church and state should remain separate. But in Daniel 2, the clay and the iron are joined together. And in Daniel 7, this political system represented by the little horn performs religious activities. There's a union of church and state. In fact, what characterizes the papacy, you need to understand that the word papacy is not interchangeable with the Catholic Church. They're 2 separate things. The Catholic Church is a church. The papacy is the union of the church with the state. That's papacy. You say, well, can you distinguish them? Yes, we can. You remember the deadly wound that the papacy received in 1798? When the Pope was taken captive, it received a deadly wound. Did the Roman Catholic Church cease to exist? No. Were the churches still open? Yes, they were. The Pope was taken captive, but the Catholic Church still functioned as a church. Did parents take their infants to be baptized? Yes. Did people go to the confessional? Yes. Did people partake of the Eucharist, which we call the Lord's Supper? Yes. The church as church continued to function. But the deadly wound was that the state turned against the church. The church and state were separated. In other words, the church could no longer use the state to accomplish its purposes. Are you with me? So the papacy is not interchangeable with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the religious aspect. Only because it is a state do you have the papacy, the union of church and state. So this little horn is a civil power, and it joins the church with the state. But Daniel chapter 7 doesn't have the total story. By the way, in Daniel 7, you also have the everlasting kingdom, right? The Father moves from the holy to the most holy. It says he sits as the judge, and the books are open, and the judgment begins. That's in 1844, after 1798, after the deadly wound. And then there's an investigative judgment of everything in the books in heaven, and after everything has been examined in the books in heaven, then Jesus returns for his faithful people that have passed through the judgment, and he establishes his everlasting kingdom, just like in Daniel 2. Now let's go to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation 13 is going to expand upon Daniel 2 and Daniel chapter 7. You have the same sequence of powers in Revelation 13 that we saw in Daniel chapter 7. Let's go to Revelation chapter 13 and verses 1 and 2. Revelation chapter 13 and verses 1 and 2. Here John writes, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." So you have this beast that rises from the sea. We're going to see that this beast that rises from the sea is the same as the little horn. In other words, the little horn is the beast of Revelation 13. And you're going to see that clearly from the Bible. So it says in verse 2, "Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave to this beast his power, his throne, and great authority." What strikes you about verse 2? Do you have the same beast as Daniel 7? Do you have the same beast? Yes. Yes. It's a combination of beasts, but the beasts are mentioned. And they're connected with Daniel chapter 7. But there's a difference. And that is that whereas in Daniel chapter 7, you have the order lion, bear, leopard, dragon with 10 horns, in Revelation chapter 13, you have 10 horns, dragon, leopard, bear, and lion. The beasts are in reverse order. And you say, why? It's very simple. Daniel was living in the period of the lion, and he's looking forward. John is living in the period of the dragon, and he's looking backward. Are you following me or not? And so Daniel looks forward from the time of the lion, And John is looking backward from the time of the dragon, because the dragon is Rome, and John lived in the period of Rome. Are you following me? Now, you have the same beast. You have a leopard, a bear, a lion, and a dragon now gives the sea beast his power, his throne, and great authority. What does this dragon represent? It's the fourth beast, this terrible beast of Daniel 7. What does that dragon represent? It represents the Roman Empire. Right? In Daniel 7, we said the fourth beast is the Roman Empire, has 10 horns. Here, this dragon beast has 10 horns. So this dragon beast represents the Roman Empire. And you say, but doesn't it represent Satan? Yeah. It represents Satan working through the Roman Empire. Let me ask you, who wanted to slay Christ when Christ was born? How many of you say that Satan wanted to slay Christ when he was born? How many of you say that Herod wanted to kill Christ when he was born? They're both true. Remember we studied about conspiracies in our first lecture together? Satan is invisible and he operates through visible kingdoms. Therefore, the dragon is Satan working upon a power that is visible. In other words, it's a dragon's dragon. Are you with me? And so the dragon that stands next to the man-child to devour him as soon as he is born is Satan working through the Roman Empire. So when it says here that the dragon gave his power, his throne, and great authority to the beast from the sea, it means that the Roman Empire is giving its throne and its power and its authority to the papacy. It's pagan Rome giving its kingdom, its power, and its authority to the beast from the sea, which is papal Rome. Just like the little horn comes out of the head of the dragon beast, in the same way we find in Revelation 13 that the dragon beast gives its authority and its power to the beast that rises from the sea. And Rome continues in papal Rome. Just like in Daniel 7, Rome continues in the little horn. See, this is a disciplined method of studying prophecy because you just follow the sequence. There's so much speculation these days. You know, you have most of the religious leaders of the conservative Christian world are saying, oh, this little horn is a bad man who's going to sit in a rebuilt Jewish temple after the rapture. And they have all this speculative scenario, and this nasty individual is going to persecute the Jews. He's going to put tattoo on people's foreheads. That's the way they're interpreting, because they don't follow the sequence of powers. This power represented by the little horn and the beast is not a person, it is a system. Let me ask you, was the head of gold a person? No, it's a kingdom. How about the breasted arms of silver? A kingdom? The belly of bronze, a kingdom? The dragon beast, a kingdom? The 10 horns, divisions of a kingdom? The little horn, a kingdom? So how can you say that the little horn or the beast is a person? In the Bible, a beast represents a nation. So the Antichrist is not going to be a person. The Antichrist is going to be a political system that mingles with religion. Now, you say, how do you know that the sea beast is the same as the little horn? Well, it's not rocket science. Let's read what the sea beast did and how long it did it. Go with me to Revelation chapter chapter 13 and verse 5 through 7. The sea beast does the same thing as the little horn did. So must they represent the same power? If the sea beast does what the little horn did, do they represent the same power? Of course they do. So it says in verse 5, and he, that is this sea beast, was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. Did the little horn do that? Yes. And he was given authority to continue what? 42 months. Is that the same as times the dividing of time? Is the sea beast the same as the little horn? Absolutely. It continues saying, then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. You have to go to Daniel, the little horn in Daniel 8 to get this characteristic. This power messes with the sanctuary ministry of Christ in heaven. He takes away the daily and he attacks the prince of the host. It was granted to him to make war with whom? With the saints. Did the little horn do that? Warred against the saints? Absolutely. And to overcome them. The little horn overcame them also. And he was given authority over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So let me ask you, is the sea beast the same power as the little horn? Absolutely. Because it does everything that the little horn did. So in Daniel chapter 7, you have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the Roman Empire, the divided Roman Empire, and then papal Rome. Times, and dividing of time. In Revelation chapter 13, it mentions the beasts in reverse order because Daniel is looking backwards. You have the same beasts. You have a lion, you have a bear, you have a leopard, you have a dragon beast with 10 horns, and the dragon beast with 10 horns then gives his kingdom, his throne, and authority to the sea beast, which is the same thing as the little horn. But Revelation 13 is going to expand upon Daniel 7. Does Daniel 7 say anything about the little horn receiving a deadly wound? Does Daniel 7 say anything about a deadly wound? No. It simply says that the little horn rules for times the dividing of time until 1798. But does it say what happened in 1798? No. Simply says that the little horn ruled till 1798. But the question is, what ended its rule? Daniel 7 doesn't say. But Revelation 13 tells us what ended the rule of the little horn or the beast. He received a deadly what? The beast or the little horn received a deadly wound. That's why it stopped ruling in 1798. Let's read about it. In Revelation chapter 13, and let's notice verse 3, the first part of the verse. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been what? As if it had been mortally wounded. What happened with this sea beast, who is the same as the little horn? It received a deadly wound. Did that end its first stage of its career? Yeah. 1798, the Pope was taken captive. When the times dividing of time ended. The Pope was taken captive, and the papacy received a deadly wound. Now, what is it that wounded the papacy? What weapon wounded the papacy? The Bible says wounded with a sword. You say, well, where is that? Well, that's in Revelation chapter 13. It says that this beast was wounded with a sword. Now, it's not a literal sword. We're dealing with symbols. So the question is, what is the meaning of the sword that ended the rule of the little horn when the 1260 years came to an end. I heard the Bible. It's true that in the Bible, that in Scripture, the sword represents the Bible. That's true. The sword of the Spirit is the Word of God. But listen carefully now. Symbols don't always mean the same thing everywhere that they appear. For example, if I ask you, what does a lion represent in the Bible? Does a lion represent Babylon? Okay. Can the lion represent Christ? He's a lion of the tribe of Judah. Can the lion represent Satan? He goes about as a roaring lion. Can a lion represent Judah, the son of Jacob? So don't think that every time that lion appears, it means the same thing. What does leaven represent in the Bible? Leaven represents, well, we say it represents sin. But not always. Because in the parable that Jesus gave of the leaven, you place the leaven in the dough and it makes the dough grow. In the same way, when Christ is in the church grows. So it can also represent the power of the Holy Spirit that brings spiritual growth. So don't think that because it was wounded with a sword, the Bible wounded the papacy. The Bible has another meaning for the sword. Go with me to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. And we're going to read Romans 13 and the first 4 verses. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. What are the governing authorities? The civil powers, the states, the political powers. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to the good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? In other words, do you want to not fear the civil power? What do we need to do? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. If you obey civil laws, you don't have to worry about the civil power, about the state. Verse 4, the key verse. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. Who has the sword? The civil powers. The civil authorities have the sword. Now let me ask you, how does a civil power use the sword? It uses to punish those who violate civil law. Can the state use the sword? Remember, it's a figurative sword. It means the power that the state has to punish violations of civil law. Let me ask you, if a person steals, can the state use the sword to punish that person? Can the state use the sword to confiscate goods that have been acquired illegally? Does the state have the power to throw someone in prison? Does the sword in some states have the authority to execute the death penalty? Yes. That's how the state uses the sword. The state uses the sword to punish violations of civil law. Are you with me? Now, what did the papacy do during its period of dominion during the 1260 years? The papacy used the sword of the state to punish those who violated the religious convictions of the church. And that same sword, the civil power that the papacy used to punish God's people who did not go along with the religion, that civil sword then rose against the papacy and gave the papacy its deadly wound, the government of France. The papacy had used the governments of Europe to persecute God's people, and so now the sword rose against it and gave it the deadly wound. And since then, the papacy has never been able to use the states of the world to do what it did during the 1260 years. Because it has a wound. Ellen White says that when the civil powers of the world once again lend the power of the sword to the papacy, its deadly wound will heal. And it will use the sword of the state like it did in the past. Is this making sense? Now, it received a mortal wound. It's still wounded because the civil powers have not restored the sword of persecution to the papacy. But what's going to happen? Notice Revelation 13, verse 3, once again. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded. And now what happens? And his deadly wound was healed. Now, let me ask you, if the deadly wound is the state turning against the church, what would be the restoration of the sword? That the state, once again, is going to lend the sword to this system. I don't know if you're following me or not. If the deadly wound is that the sword of the state rises against the papacy, then the restoration of the sword must mean that the civil powers will return the power of the state to the papacy. Because its deadly wound is going to be what? Healed. Does this add to Daniel 7 details that are not in Daniel 7? Oh, you better believe it adds that. Now here's the key question. Which power is going to restore the sword to the papacy? The support of the civil power to the papacy. Here's where things get very interesting. There's another beast that rises from the earth in the second half of Revelation 13 that is going to restore the sword to the papacy. This beast, we're going to identify it in a few moments, that has two horns like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. Everything that this beast from the earth does, it does to help the beast that lost its power get it back. Let me give you the list. It says in Revelation 13, 11 to 18, that this beast that rises from the earth exercises all the authority of the first beast. It says that it commands everyone to worship the first beast. Everything it does in the presence of the first beast. It makes an image of the first beast. And it imposes the mark of the first beast. This beast from the earth is the instrument that is going to return the sword of civil power to the papacy, the power that it lost during the 1260 years. None of this has happened yet. This is taking us to the future. And by the way, things are happening these days where it could happen very quickly. You know, I don't like to get involved in political discussions. But this Project 2025 and Donald Trump being in the pocket of the evangelicals and having an American pope, etc., does not bode well for religious liberty. Now the question is, what does this beast from the earth represent? It must be another nation, because it's a beast. Let's notice the characteristics of this beast that rises from the earth. It's a symbol of the United States of America. Let me ask you, did the United States rise around the same time that the papacy received its deadly wound? Around the same time. The papacy falls, the United States rises. That's why the historicist method is so important. Because you have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the Roman Empire. Roman Empire is divided into 10 kingdoms. Then you have the papacy rise, falls in 1798. And when the papacy falls, the next power is rising, which is the United States of America. Let's notice the characteristics. We know that this beast from the earth must be a nation. Why? Because a beast represents a nation. We've noticed that. So it must be some nation that rises around the same time that the papacy is put out of commission. Secondly, first of all, it's a nation because it's a beast. Secondly, this beast rises around the same time that the sea beast received its deadly wound with a sword, which was 1798. Do you know the first nation that the United States established diplomatic relations with? France. I bet you can't guess what year. 1798. The power that gave the deadly wound to the papacy is the first power that recognized diplomatically the United States of America in 1798. Interesting. Furthermore, this beast rises from the earth. The other beast rose from where? From the sea. What does the sea represent? It represents multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. Did the papacy rise in a place that was very densely populated? Europe? Yes. But this beast has to rise in a different place because it doesn't rise from the sea where there's multitudes. It rises from the earth where there are no waters. Was the United States territory sparsely populated when the United States rose to power? Absolutely. So that's a third characteristic. Furthermore, you know what's interesting? Prophecy moves from east to west. Prophecy moves from east to west. The first two kingdoms in Daniel 7 are in Asia. The next two kingdoms are in Europe. Where would you expect the next nation to arise? Further west. And what is west of Europe? Don't tell me the Atlantic Ocean. What nation arose further west than Europe? The United States of America. Now, there's much more I could say about this, but when I encourage you, when this series comes out, you watch it. Critically important. Sharing with the world. Furthermore, we're told in Revelation chapter 13 that when this beast rises, it is just sprouting. It has not reached the apex of its power in 1798. It says, I saw a nation rise from the earth. That word rise is used, for example, in the parable of the sower, where the seed is planted and it sprouts. It's not when it's full grown. And this nation, when it is full grown, is going to be a political superpower, an economic superpower, and a military superpower. And you say, how do we know that? We know it's an economic superpower because it's going to be able to forbid buying and selling. We know that it's going to be a political superpower because every nation is going to follow its example. And we know that it's going to be a powerful military nation because it is going to emit a death decree against those who do not comply. In other words, from just sprouting in 1798, it was going to become a world superpower. Can you think of any other nation than the United States who fits this characteristic? Everything fits the United States of America. The final point that I want us to notice as we discuss what this beast represents is the fact that this beast has two horns like a lamb. But it ends up speaking how? Like a dragon. Like the persecuting dragon. Now, what do the two horns represent? In the Bible, horns represent kingdoms. Go with me to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8. This is the closest parallel to what we find in Revelation chapter 13. It's speaking about the Medes and Persians. Listen carefully. Two kingdoms in one nation. Medes, Persians, but together in one nation. Two kingdoms in one nation. Notice chapter 8 and verse 3. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram. Only one beast, right? Only one beast. A ram. But the beast, the one beast has what? Oh, one beast, one nation with two horns, two kingdoms. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. Now, what does this ram with two horns represent? Let's go to verse 20, where we find the explanation. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. So you have one nation composed of two kingdoms. Now let me ask you, is the United States one nation with two kingdoms? You say, well, no. It's only one nation, one kingdom. No, it isn't. In the founding documents of the United States of America, particularly in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, there's a recognition of the existence of two kingdoms in one nation. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Does the First Amendment recognize the existence of the church and the state? Yes. Does it separate church and state? Yes, because it says that Congress can't make any law that establishes religion. So it recognizes religion. But it says that the state cannot intermeddle with religion. Not only that, but the First Amendment also says that the state cannot forbid the free exercise thereof of religion. The First Amendment separates church and state. The government cannot establish any religious observance. The government cannot forbid people from practicing their religion. The state is separate from the church. Two kingdoms in one nation. The church and the state. By the way, the First Amendment also guarantees civil rights. Because the third clause of the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now comes the civil rights. Or abridging the freedom of speech. Is that a civil right? Freedom of speech? Yes. Or of the press. Is that a civil right? Or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Is that a civil right? And to petition the government for a redress of grievances. If somebody does you injustice, do you have a right to ask the government to make things right? The courts? Yes. So the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States guarantees civil and religious liberty. It forbids Congress from making any law that establishes religion or forbids your right to free exercise of religion. The United States is unique in that, in the world. And there's an attack against the First Amendment these days in the United States. You have even individuals in the Adventist Church that say, the Constitution doesn't say that there's supposed to be separation between church and state. Well, the Constitution doesn't say separate church and state, but the First Amendment makes it very clear that they're separate. Because Congress cannot make any law that enforces religion or forbids people to practice their religion. The first is called the Establishment Clause, and the second is called the Free Exercise Clause. Do you know what happens when the government tries to establish religion and when it tries to take away the right for you to practice your religion? The result is persecution and the loss of civil rights. So a violation of the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses by Congress brings about persecution and the loss of civil rights. That's why religious and civil rights were placed in the First Amendment, because they're related. Let me give you two biblical examples. Daniel chapter 3. That chapter shows what happens when the government establishes a religious observance. Let me ask you, did Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 3 establish religion? Yes, he raised up an image. And he commanded everyone to worship the image. And what would happen if with those who did not worship the image? They would lose the greatest civil right, life. Let me ask you, is religious liberty related to civil liberty? Yes. So Nebuchadnezzar establishes a religious observance. He's the civil power of the government. He says, everybody's going to worship this way. Kneel and worship the image. What happened to those who refused? They were going to lose their greatest civil right, life. And of course, Jesus had to come into the furnace to deliver the three young men, like Jesus is going to deliver his people at the end of time, when the United States restores the sword to the papacy. And in Daniel 6, you have an illustration of the second clause of the First Amendment. In Daniel chapter 6, the king does not establish religion, he forbids the free exercise of religion. See, the stories are related. In Daniel 6, the king gives a decree. Of course, he was influenced by his leaders, and they were influenced by the devil. And basically he says, for 30 days, no one can pray to their God. Make no request to their God. Is he forbidding the free exercise of religion? He's forbidding your right to pray. And what happened as a result of forbidding the free exercise of religion? The threat of you losing the civil right of life. And God had to intervene in the lion's den. And the lions behaved as kittens while Daniel was in there. And somebody might say, well, the lions weren't hungry. You don't think? The Bible says that the creators of the plot were cast into the den of lions, and before they hit the bottom, the lions were having the banquet of their lives. Is religious liberty related to civil liberty? Yes. Let me ask you, what characterized the papacy during the 1260 years? What characterized the papacy? What was the central characteristic of the papacy? The central characteristic of the papacy was that the church was able to use the power of the state to enforce religion, to forbid the free exercise of religion, and as a result, persecution. That's what the papacy is. The papacy is a totalitarian system. It's a dictatorship. The people have no rights in the Roman Catholic Church. The hierarchy dictates what they do and what they don't do. And woe to those who do not do or not do what the church says. And so papacy means the church using the state, and those who do not abide by what the church uses the state to say, the result is persecution. That's the papacy. And that is what is going to be restored by the United States of America. And developments are taking place these days that will lead to that. So now we can understand what the image of the beast is. It's the United States that's going to raise an image of the beast, because it says it both ways, of the beast and in honor of the beast. Of the beast and to the beast. The United States is going to do that. What is the image? The image is that the United States is going to do the same thing that the papacy did during the 1260 years. The United States of America is going to enforce religion by using the civil power of the state. And it is going to forbid the observance of the Sabbath by using the power of the state. The United States is going to make a replica, is going to make an image, a shadow of what the papacy was during the 1260 years. So when the United States, through its Congress, is Congress the voice of the people? Yeah, it says this beast speaks like a dragon. See, it has this idea of two kingdoms separate, the two horns, one nation, two kingdoms, but it's going to reject that. And it is going to speak like the persecuting dragon. It's going to do what the papacy did during the 1260 years when its wound is healed. The United States will lend the papacy a sword, the sword of civil power, to punish violations of religious law. The state has the right to punish violations of civil law, but not violations of religious law, because the government can have nothing to do with religion other than to allow people to practice their religion according to the dictates of their conscience. Let me ask you, would a Sunday law be unconstitutional? You think a Sunday law given by Congress would be a violation of the First Amendment? Yes, because the First Amendment says that Congress can make no law that establishes religion. And establishing Sunday is an establishment of religion. It would be unconstitutional. But the United States is going to repudiate its Constitution. It's going to act like it recognizes the two principles, but it's going to speak like a dragon. In other words, it's going to contradict its profession. Let me ask you, would a law that forbids the observance of the Sabbath be unconstitutional? Yes, because the First Amendment guarantees that you can practice your religion. No one can forbid me from keeping the Sabbath or force me to keep Sunday, because Congress can make no law that establishes religion or forbids the free exercise of religion. The government cannot have anything to do with religion. Of course, unless, for example, a religion says that our religion believes in sacrificing children, then the government has a reason to intervene, because the government is to establish the protection of life. So what is the image of the beast? The image of the beast is simply the union of church and state in the United States of America that will return the sword of persecution to the papacy to those who do not comply with what the papacy wants. I want to recommend that you read a chapter in the book, The Great Controversy. It's one of the most important chapters that we find in the book. The chapter is titled, God's Law Immutable. It is a powerful exposition of Revelation 12 and 13 and Daniel 7. Ellen White is so absolutely logical. She leads from one point to the next point to the next point. For me, it's proof that she was inspired by God. So read that chapter when you go back home. Read God's Law Immutable, which means that God's law cannot be changed. So did you understand what we studied this afternoon? Yes. What is the mark of the beast? We studied that this morning. What is the mark of the beast? The imposition of Sunday as a day of rest. Does anybody have the mark of the beast yet? No, because the Sunday law has not been enforced. That's where we decide whether we receive the mark or not. Nobody has yet the mark of the beast. But decisions that people are making today might lead them to receive the mark of the beast. So, Sunday observance, knowing that the Sabbath is God's day of rest, is the mark of the beast. And the image of the beast is the enforcement mechanism where the United States will lend the sword of civil power to the papacy to persecute as it did during the first stage of its existence, during the 1260 years. Well, any questions? We still have a little bit of time. Anybody have any questions that you want to ask? Was what we studied clear? Yes, brother. Yes, 1888. I have, in my series on Matthew 24, I have a couple of presentations on what happened in 1888. In 1888, Senator Blair was maneuvering to have Congress add an amendment to the Constitution enforcing Sunday as a day of rest. It failed. But it shows what the devil has in mind. He has in mind that the United States use the sword of civil power to enforce the religious observances of the papacy. In that sense, it's the image of the papacy. Well, if there are no further comments, let's take a little rest. It's 25 minutes after 3. Maybe we can start a little bit earlier. You think? We're going to talk about how to live in the time of trouble after the close of probation. So let's come back, say, at 3:45. That sound okay? That'll give us 20 minutes of rest. So 20 minutes, 3:45, Law of Medes and Persians. We will begin our second and last presentation.